Bitter Hollow never wanted her. Charlotte Bainbridge was just a widow, and Silas Crow was just a Lakota outcast. But when winter came, and the town turned desperate, the two they cast aside became the only ones who could save them. Sometimes survival isn't about forgiveness. It's about standing together when no one else will. The whistle of the afternoon train echoed like a lonely cry across the endless plains. Dust swirled and danced under a cruel sun as Bitter Hollow's small, weathered station came into view. The town, if you could even call it that, wasn't much. Just crooked wooden buildings, a saloon with a leaning sign, and folks who stared harder than they spoke. Inside the last car of the train, Charlotte Bainbridge pressed gloved fingers against the window pane. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times on the journey west. Her corset bit into her ribs, her traveling hat sat perfectly on pin curls, and her hands were folded tightly over a faded letter that had guided her every mile. Samuel Green, the letter read, a man of faith and steady hands, seeking a good woman to share his home. Charlotte had answered it months ago. Leaving the gray skies of Pennsylvania, her father's cold grave, and debts too heavy for a single woman to carry alone, she had stepped into the unknown for the promise of a future. She wasn't naive. Marriage wasn't love, not out here, but it was stability, respect, a place to belong. The train hissed and groaned as it came to a halt. Charlotte stood, gathering her valise and smoothing her skirts. She paused, steadying herself. "This is it," she whispered. The platform was empty. No eager suitor waited with flowers. No warm smile to meet hers. She stepped down anyway, feeling the eyes of townsfolk drift her way like ghosts. They watched from porches and dusty windows, murmuring low enough to make her skin prickle. Minutes dragged on. Finally, a stout man in a frayed deputy's badge approached, removing his hat. "Miss Bainbridge?" he asked, his voice low and awkward. "Yes, I am Charlotte Bainbridge. I'm here to meet Samuel Green." The man looked down, scuffed his boot against the wood. "I'm real sorry, ma'am. Samuel's dead. Typhoid got him 2 weeks back." Charlotte's mouth went dry. The world tilted just a little. "Dead?" she repeated, voice thin as silk thread about to snap. "Buried on the hill yonder." He gestured vaguely. "Ain't no kin left. Guess no one thought to send word to you." The weight of her journey, of months spent in hope, came crashing down in an instant. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. What am I supposed to do?" she asked quietly. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, there's a boarding house, but Miss Ada don't take to strangers much. Or, the livery's warm enough for tonight. Up to you." He tipped his hat, leaving her stranded in silence as he walked away. The people watching didn't offer help. They didn't speak, just stared, as if she was already a ghost among them. Charlotte stood there for what felt like forever, clutching her valise until her fingers hurt. By sundown, she was desperate. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the heavy skies promised a cold night. Pride could only carry a woman so far. Swallowing her dignity, she made her way to the livery stable, a low, squat building that smelled of hay and horses. She pushed the heavy door open. The fading light revealed a man brushing down a dark bay horse. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms dusted with grit. He didn't look up. I was told I might be able to stay here tonight," Charlotte ventured softly. The man paused, turned slowly. He was younger than she expected, though his face carried years beyond his age. Weathered skin, eyes sharp and unreadable. There was something about him, still as stone, but dangerous too. "Not a hotel," he said flatly. "I understand," Charlotte replied, summoning every ounce of politeness, "but I have nowhere else to go. Just until morning." "Please?" His gaze lingered on her face, taking in the fine Eastern clothes, the worn shoes, the hope slipping quietly from her eyes. "Name's Silas Crow," he said at last. His voice was deep, rough around the edges like sandpaper. "You can sleep in the hayloft. Ain't fancy, but warmer than out there." Relief broke over Charlotte, and she nodded quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Crow." He didn't answer, simply turned back to his horse, as if her existence no longer concerned him. Charlotte climbed the narrow ladder into the loft. She spread her small shawl across the loose hay and sat down heavily. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. not where they could be seen. As night crept in and the stable quieted, she heard Silas moving below, feeding the horses, whistling low. There was something comforting in the steady rhythm of it. A man of few words, yet grounded in a way the townsfolk weren't. Later, just as sleep began to take her, she heard his voice drift up from the dark. "Folks here don't like outsiders," Silas said. It wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. "Don't expect much." "I don't need much," Charlotte whispered back. A pause. "Good," he said simply. And that was the end of it. The next morning, before dawn broke pink across the horizon, Charlotte awoke to the sound of boots on the ladder. Silas appeared, holding a chipped mug of coffee. "Reckon you'll need this," he said, offering it to her. Surprised, she accepted it carefully. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. "I'm grateful," she murmured. Silas shrugged. "No one should face Bitter Hollow alone." "You got plans?" Charlotte hesitated. "I don't know. I came to marry a man. Now I suppose I'll find work." His expression darkened faintly, but he said nothing more. He left her sitting in the hay as he went back to his chores, but Charlotte noticed something had shifted. He had brought her coffee. He had acknowledged her in his quiet, blunt way. Maybe Bitter Hollow was unforgiving. Maybe the people whispered and watched like vultures. But there, in the dusty livery, with horses shuffling softly in their stalls, Charlotte found her first small thread of kindness. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in the West, sometimes that was all you got. Morning came harsh and without mercy in Bitter Hollow. By the time Charlotte stepped down from the loft, brushing straw from her skirts, the stable yard was already alive with movement. Ranch hands and drifters alike shuffled through, muttering greetings to Silas but casting her cold, curious glances. She felt them press against her skin like nettles. She wasn't welcome here. That much was clear. Silas Crow moved with quiet purpose as he saddled his horse. He didn't waste words, and Charlotte didn't offer many either. But when she hesitated near the stable door, unsure where to go, he noticed. "You got no place lined up, do you?" he asked, tightening the leather strap. Charlotte shook her head, feeling small. No one in this town seems eager to hire a woman like me." "Because you ain't from here. Outsiders spook 'em." Silas wiped his hands on a cloth, his jaw ticking. "They think anyone from the East thinks they're better." "I don't think that," Charlotte said quickly, hurt flickering through her voice. He glanced sideways. "Doesn't matter what you think. Matters what they think." Silas's bluntness was sharp, but it wasn't cruel. It was honest. Something that, Charlotte was beginning to realize, was rare in Bitter Hollow. She hesitated, then asked the question weighing on her chest. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her long and hard, then tugged his hat lower against the sun. "'Cause I know what it's like to have nowhere to go," he said simply. Then he turned away to tend to the horses, leaving Charlotte standing there with her heart unsteady. By noon, the town had already made up its mind. Charlotte learned this firsthand when she stepped into the general store. Conversation stopped. The owner, a squat man with a sour mouth named Gil Dobbins, didn't bother hiding his disdain. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he muttered as she approached the counter. Charlotte swallowed her pride. "I'd like to buy a few things, please." Gil leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "With what money, missy?" "Ain't exactly running a charity." She offered him the coin she had left from her journey. Enough, she hoped, for a few essentials. But Gil only smirked and knocked them back toward her with his stubby fingers. "Don't want your fancy Eastern money. Folks around here take care of their own. And you? You ain't one of us." A flush of humiliation burned across Charlotte's cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but froze when another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The room fell silent as Silas Crow stepped through the doorway. He stood like a shadow cast long across the room, calm but edged in quiet steel. Gil's smirk faltered. "Ain't no problem, Crow. Just explaining town ways." Silas didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just stared at Gil, unblinking. "She's buying. You're selling. That's the way it works." A beat passed and something silent but heavy shifted in the room. Gil relented with a grunt, snatching up Charlotte's coins and bagging the supplies roughly. As Charlotte gathered her things, her hands trembled slightly. Silas didn't say anything until they were back out on the dusty street. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yeah," Silas replied, adjusting the brim of his hat. "But I did." Word spread fast. By sundown, Charlotte knew half the town had twisted the tale. Some said she was a gold digger, come to claw at Samuel Green's land. Others whispered she'd bewitched Silas Crow, a loner who never cared for anyone but his horses. That night, she sat on the edge of her makeshift bed in the loft, staring at the knot of stars outside the cracked window. "What am I doing here?" she whispered aloud, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "I should leave, find somewhere, kinder." But the words felt hollow. Leaving would mean running again, running from every closed door, every turn back. She'd done that enough. Below, she heard Silas's heavy boots crossing the stable floor. She waited, hoping he wouldn't speak, and hoping he would. Finally, his voice rose from the darkness. "People here, they don't take to change," he said, as if continuing a conversation they never started. "You stay quiet, they'll forget about you. Or you push back, and they'll fight harder." Charlotte hugged her knees. "What do you suggest?" Silas paused. Then with surprising softness, he answered, "Be stronger than them. Stand your ground, or they'll crush you without even noticing." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was shared. It meant something. The next day, they tried to drive her out. Miss Ada, the owner of the boarding house, cornered Charlotte on the main street. Women gathered like crows, whispering sharp as knives. "Decent folks don't sleep in stables with men, Miss Bainbridge," Ada hissed. "You're making a spectacle of yourself." Before Charlotte could defend herself, Silas appeared, silent as ever but steady as bedrock. He didn't threaten, didn't curse. He just stood beside Charlotte, his presence alone enough to break Ada's confidence. "She's done nothing wrong," he said calmly, "and anyone with sense knows it." The townsfolk didn't argue, not out loud. But Charlotte saw their eyes narrow and their mouths twist as they turned away. When they were alone again, she looked up at Silas, her throat thick. "Why do you keep standing up for me?" she asked. His face didn't soften, but his voice did. "Because no one else will. And maybe you deserve someone who does." Charlotte didn't know what to say. For the first time in Bitter Hollow, someone hadn't looked at her like a burden or a problem. Someone had looked at her and decided she was worth standing beside. And deep in her chest, where loneliness had built its walls high and tight, something small and bright began to push through the cracks. The following days unfolded like a slow, steady duel. No pistols drawn, no bullets flying, but every stare, every muttered word was a shot aimed straight at Charlotte Bainbridge's back. The town wanted her gone. They didn't say it outright. Bitter Hollow was too old and too proud for plain words. But doors didn't open when she knocked. Church pews stayed empty where she sat. Children were pulled close when she passed. Charlotte felt it, the weight of being unwanted, the sharp sting of exclusion that had nothing to do with what she had done, and everything to do with who she was. Eastern, educated, alone. But she did not leave. Silas Crow noticed. Each morning, when she walked down from the loft with her head held just a little higher, he saw it, that stubborn pride stitched into her spine. She offered to help around the stables in return for her stay. Silas said it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. Sweeping, feeding horses, fixing a busted hinge with hands that had once only held quills and teacups. Day by day she grew harder, not cruel, never cruel, but resilient. And day by day Silas began talking more. Not much, not about himself, but enough. He told her about the ranch, how he'd built it up from nothing after years running cattle trails farther west, how Bitter Hollow had barely tolerated him when he first arrived because of his mixed Lakota blood, but came to depend on him when the winters turned brutal. "They don't respect kindness," he said quietly one evening, whittling a piece of wood as they sat outside under a bruised purple sky. "But they respect work and fear." Charlotte turned to him then, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. "Is that why you help me? You respect me now?" Silas's knife slowed. He met her eyes with that calm, unreadable gaze of his. "I respect anyone who refuses to break." Charlotte didn't smile, but her chest felt warm in a way that startled her. In Bitter Hollow, kindness came rare and sharp-edged, like rain after a drought. But peace never lasted long here. It was 3 days later when the trouble truly began. It started small. A broken fence on Silas's north pasture. Then 2 horses let loose during the night. Charlotte woke to shouts and running boots, and by dawn, Silas's jaw was clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. Deliberate, he muttered, inspecting the cut ropes. Charlotte's stomach nodded. You think it's because of me? Silas didn't answer, which for him was answer enough. By noon they had names. Walt McClure and Jasper Hollis, ranchers who had never liked Silas much, and who now saw him as sheltering the outsider, stirring up Bitter Hollow's settled dust. They won't stop, Silas said grimly, oiling his rifle later that evening. Charlotte, standing nearby, folded her arms tight against her chest. Then let me go, she said softly. If I leave, this ends. Silas set the rifle down and stood, his height shadowing hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then with slow certainty, he shook his head. Number, that's what they want. You leave, they win. Charlotte's throat tightened. You don't owe me anything, Silas. Why risk yourself for me? Silas's face darkened, not with anger, but something deeper. Older. Heavy with years he never spoke about. Maybe I'm tired of watching good people get pushed until they got nowhere left to stand, he said quietly. Maybe I'm tired of being the one who looks away. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low. Stay. You've got me in this now, and I don't back down easy. Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her in that moment, not in fear, but in certainty. Silas Crow was a man who spoke little, but meant every word. If he said he would stand beside her, then come what may, he would. And as dusk fell, Charlotte realized something she hadn't before. For the first time since Samuel Green had died, since she'd been tossed aside like yesterday's news, she wasn't alone. The night burned quiet and heavy, but come morning everything changed. A rider galloped into Bitter Hollow with news that spread faster than prairie fire. Walt McClure had filed papers at the county office, a claim that Samuel Green's land, Charlotte's promised home, was up for grabs, that she, a widow with no blood kin in the territory, had no legal right to it. They mean to force me out legally, Charlotte whispered, reading the crude flyer nailed outside the saloon. Her hands trembled, but not from fear this time, from fury. They want to erase me, she added bitterly, like I never belonged at all. Silas Crow stood beside her, arms crossed. His face was carved from stone. No one erases you unless you let them, he said darkly. And if they want to fight, they just got one. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes wide. This is your town, Silas. You've got your life here. If you stand with me, they'll turn on you too. Silas didn't blink. He just spoke, firm and final. Then let them. In that moment, on that dusty street where everyone stared and whispered and hoped she'd fold, Charlotte Bainbridge knew something vital had shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but loyalty, steel-hard and unspoken. And in Bitter Hollow, where every kind word came wrapped in barbed wire, that meant more than love. They came at dawn, not with torches or rifles. No, Bitter Hollow prided itself on doing things with a veneer of civility. The mob wore Sunday clothes, pressed hats. They knocked politely, but Charlotte Bainbridge knew what they really were. Silas was already outside when she opened the door, his frame cutting an imposing figure against the pale gold light of morning. He didn't need to say anything. The shotgun resting loosely in his hands said enough. Walt McClure stood at the front of the pack, thumb hooked arrogantly in his belt. Morning, Crow, he said, voice oily smooth. Ain't here to make trouble. Just come to explain things to the lady proper. Charlotte stepped forward before Silas could answer. Her skirts brushed the dirt. She kept her chin high. I can listen just fine without the whole town breathing down my neck, Mr. McClure. Walt smiled thinly. Around him, men shifted uncomfortably. See, Miss Bainbridge, it's simple. That land was promised to Samuel, not you. He's gone, and the claim is dead. You're free to stay in town, of course. But that ranch, that's for someone who can work it, Someone local. Charlotte felt her heart hammer. Not in fear, but in sheer blistering rage. I can work it, she said coldly. I am working it. And if the law says I have no right, let the law take it. Not you and your bullies. The crowd bristled at the word. Silas took a step closer. His voice, when it came, was quiet steel. She's under my roof, he said. You aim to push her, you push me too. Walt's smile turned nasty. Funny, Crow. Thought you were smarter than that. This ain't your fight. You don't belong in it. Hell, you barely belong here at all. Charlotte's stomach twisted. It wasn't subtle, the way Walt's eyes flicked to Silas's skin. Lakota blood or not, Silas had carved out respect in Bitter Hollow. But now they were reminding him how thin that respect really was. Silas didn't flinch. He only shifted the shotgun casually in his grip. You done talking, Walt? For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Walt, realizing Silas wouldn't be baited into throwing the first punch, gave a mocking tip of his hat. Suit yourself. But it won't end here, Crow. She's stirring up bad wind. Town's gonna decide one way or another. He turned. The others followed, boots crunching on frost-laced dirt. They didn't slam doors or shout threats. They didn't have to. The message was clear. Charlotte stood frozen until they were gone. Then slowly she turned to Silas. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, throat tight. They'll come for you now, too. Silas's eyes were unreadable. They already came for me a long time ago, he said softly. I learned early. You give them your back. They bury the knife deep. You face them. Sometimes they step back. Sometimes they don't. Either way, you stand. Charlotte couldn't stop it this time. The emotion broke through. She surged forward and hugged him. It surprised them both. For a second, Silas stiffened, but then his arms came around her. Solid, sure, safe. It wasn't tender, not exactly. It was grounding. She didn't realize until that moment how long it had been since she had felt like someone had her back. She stepped away quickly, cheeks flushed. I won't run, she said firmly. Silas nodded, his lips tugging into the faintest shadow of a smile. Didn't think you would. The next days felt like the eye of a storm. Too quiet, too still. Charlotte worked the ranch harder than ever, fixing fences, checking cattle, even riding into town for supplies, though no one met her eyes when she did. Silas remained nearby, watchful but never hovering. They spoke little during the day, but at night as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, words came easier. Charlotte learned about his mother, a Lakota healer who taught him to listen before speaking. About his father, a white trapper who taught him how cruel men could be when you didn't fit into neat boxes. Silas, in turn, learned about her father, a Boston banker who thought the West was beneath their kind, and about Samuel Green, who had promised her stars but died before giving her even dust. It wasn't romance, not yet, but something was being built, brick by brick, respect, trust, and underneath it all, the simmering heat of something neither dared name. But Bitter Hollow hadn't forgotten. It came to a head when Charlotte received a summons. The town council had called a meeting. Walt McClure had filed an official challenge for the land. They wanted her there. They wanted a decision. Silas's jaw tightened when she showed him the letter. They'll outvote you, he warned. It's stacked. Charlotte's throat went dry. I can't win, can I? Silas's face was unreadable again, but his voice was soft. Maybe not, but if you walk in there alone, they win without firing a shot. Charlotte stared at him. Then slowly she nodded. I won't go alone. And when the night came, and she rode into town in her plain riding dress and wind-tangled hair, Silas rode beside her. Side by side, two outcasts. Two people Bitter Hollow didn't want, but couldn't ignore. When they tied their horses outside the council hall, Charlotte looked up at him. No matter how this goes, she said quietly. Thank you. Silas's eyes met hers in the half-light. Not done yet, he murmured. And together they stepped into the lion's den. The hall fell silent when they entered. Wooden benches creaked, faces turned. No warm welcomes, no polite nods. Just eyes, cold, assessing, and waiting. Charlotte could feel the weight of every stare press against her spine like iron bands. Even the mayor, John Pritchard, a rotund man with whiskey-red cheeks, looked uncomfortable as he cleared his throat. "Miss Bainbridge, Mr. Crow," he said, his voice thin and papery, "this is a town matter." Silas didn't blink. "I know, but Charlotte speaks for the land, and I speak for her." A ripple of unease shot through the room. The lines couldn't be clearer now. Us and them, white and Lakota, tradition and defiance. Walt McClure stood, always eager to be the loudest voice. "No one's here to argue race, Crow," he said with mock sweetness. "This is about the future of Bitter Hollow. The ranch is too much for a widow. Always was. Samuel promised to build this town's cattle trade. Without him, that land is wasted. And we can't afford waste." The words hit Charlotte harder than she expected. She had worked herself raw, fighting wind, dust, and loneliness. And now they dared to call it wasted. She stood slowly, forcing herself to meet every eye. "That land wasn't wasted when Samuel's name was on it," she said. "It wasn't wasted when I stayed after he died, fixing fences and paying debts he left behind. It wasn't wasted when I opened my gates to neighbors who needed grazing. You only decided it was wasted when I proved I didn't need saving." Walt scoffed. "You're twisting words, Miss Bainbridge." But Charlotte didn't back down. Not this time. "No," she said sharply. "You just don't like that the land listens to me as much as it did him. Or maybe it's because I have help now. And you can't stomach the idea of a Lakota man standing beside me while you stand here doing nothing." That shattered the room's thin facade of civility. Murmurs broke out, some shocked, some angry. Even Mayor Pritchard's face turned crimson as he banged the gavel. "Enough! This is a vote, not a debate." But Charlotte had already said what needed saying. They knew the truth now, even if they'd choke on it. The votes came fast. Walt and his lot voted no. Of course. The old guard, the fearful, the small-minded, all against her keeping the ranch. But something shifted in the quiet between ballots. Clara Welch, the baker whose husband had been thrown from Charlotte's land when he tried stealing her cattle, hesitated before raising her hand. Elias Wren, the blacksmith who never spoke at meetings, avoided Charlotte's eyes as he voted yes, clearly pushed by old debts to McClure. The tally teetered dangerously, and then Mayor Pritchard set his pen down with a sigh. "Tied," Walt grinned triumphantly. "Then it defaults. Without majority, she forfeits." "No." Silas's voice cut like a blade through the tension. The mayor blinked. "You don't vote, Mr. Crow." Silas took a step forward, eyes hard and voice low. The kind of voice meant for hunting grounds and war councils. "Number, but I can make them remember what they're voting on." And then he spoke. Not in anger, not with threats, but quietly, patiently, the way his mother had taught him long ago, under starlit skies while fires whispered secrets. He spoke of the land, of how Charlotte stayed through windstorms that broke fences and took roofs, of how she pulled calves from frozen mud while Bitter Hollow's sons drank warm in taverns, of how she stood day after day, feeding townsfolk with beef from her herds even when they stopped speaking to her, and of how, when wolves came, human and otherwise, it wasn't the mayor or Walt or any of them who guarded her door. It was Silas. "Honor matters," Silas finished softly. "It matters more than rules scribbled down by scared men who think tradition is law. You take her land, you take her spirit. And if you do, don't expect her to be the only one leaving." Silence, heavy, complete. Then, against all odds, Clara Welch stood up. "I changed my vote," she said quietly. Elias Wren followed. So did another. And just like that, the tide broke. Charlotte stared as Mayor Pritchard scratched the final tally down and swallowed heavily. "Majority, yes," he declared, almost reluctantly. Her knees almost gave out. She gripped the table to steady herself as Walt McClure stormed out, face dark and twisted. She had won. But it wasn't victory she felt. It was gratitude, and a weight so heavy it almost broke her in half. She turned to Silas, tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you." Silas, ever the man of few words, only shrugged. "Wasn't for thanks," he said simply. "It was because you stood, and standing alone, Gets cold after a while. Charlotte smiled, though her throat tightened painfully. Then stay, she whispered, if standing together makes it warmer. Silas's lips curved, just slightly. Maybe I will. Outside, Bitter Hollow remained the same cruel, windswept town it had always been. But inside that hall, between the widow and the outcast, something new had rooted itself. Something Bitter Hollow couldn't vote away. Weeks passed. Bitter Hollow didn't transform overnight. The stares still lingered. The whispers still snuck through saloon doors and across dusty porches. But something in the town's spine had cracked when Charlotte Bainbridge stood her ground, and when Silas Crow stood beside her. The ranch became more than land. It became a line in the sand. They worked side by side as if they always had. Silas with his quiet strength, teaching her how to read the winds and when to rest the cattle. Charlotte with stubborn grace, managing books and settling disputes between hands who were wary but loyal. At night, they'd sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The silence between them grew comfortable, full of things neither felt the need to say aloud. But Charlotte knew that without Silas, the ranch would have slipped through her fingers, knew that without his steady presence, she would have withered under the town's cold gaze. And Silas knew something too, knew that, for the first time since his people were pushed onto brittle soil and treaties broken like promises, he had found a place where his name wasn't spoken like a curse. He didn't say it, not yet, but Charlotte saw it in the way he lingered when chores were done, in the way his eyes softened when they met hers across a table cluttered with ledgers and old coffee cups. She didn't push. Love, she'd learned, didn't need a gallop. It needed space to walk. Then winter came hard, the worst the town had seen in a decade. Snow piled high, trapping wagons and sealing doors. Livestock perished overnight. The saloon stores ran low. Desperation clawed Bitter Hollow's belly. That's when they came. Walt McClure and the rest, the same men who had voted to strip her of everything, now stood shivering on Charlotte's porch, hats in hand. Cattle, Walt muttered, unable to meet her eyes. Yours are the only herds left strong enough to butcher. We can't keep people fed otherwise. Charlotte stared, anger rising, the taste of their past cruelty bitter on her tongue. But Silas only touched her shoulder lightly. His voice when he spoke wasn't cruel, just steady. We feed them. Charlotte turned sharply. After everything they did? Silas's eyes met hers, calm as moonlit water. That's why. Feed them, and this land will remember it. People forget kindness faster than cruelty. But land always remembers who cared for its people. The words settled deep in Charlotte's chest, not because they excused Bitter Hollow, but because they reminded her that survival wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. So she nodded, and together they opened the gates. For days, townsfolk came, proud men forced to bow their heads, mothers clutching thin children. Charlotte and Silas handed out meat and grain, asking nothing in return. Slowly, the town's frost began to thaw, not just outside, but inside. Clara Welch came by with loaves of bread, shame softening her face. Elias Wren offered horseshoes free of charge. And one by one, Bitter Hollow began to see them not as the widow and the Lakota outcast, but as their own. Spring broke early that year. The snows melted fast, running like silver ribbons through the ravines. Life returned, and so did a sense of belonging Charlotte hadn't dared hope for. One evening, under a sky painted in bruised purples and fading gold, Charlotte stood beside Silas by the corral, watching calves stumble, wild and new. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. They don't look at you the same anymore. Silas didn't answer at first. He only watched the horizon, thoughtful. They see me now, he said finally. Not as Lakota, not as threat, just as a man. Charlotte smiled softly. You were always that. Silas turned then, his face open in a way it rarely was. And you, he said, his voice lower, rougher with emotion. You weren't just fighting for the ranch. You were fighting to stand tall when no one wanted you to. Charlotte's throat tightened. There had been days when she thought she couldn't, but Silas never let her fall. Before fear or doubt could slip between them, she took a small step forward, close enough that his warmth met hers in the cool night air. "Stay," she whispered, eyes glistening. "Not just on the ranch, not just through winter. Stay with me." Silas hesitated for the briefest moment. Warrior, wanderer, outsider. Then he smiled faintly. "As long as the land remembers us," he said softly, "I'll stay." Charlotte's smile broke free, radiant and raw. No kiss sealed it, no grand declaration echoed. Just two hands meeting in quiet promise beneath the stars. Bitter Hollow wouldn't remember the votes, or the cruelty, or even the blizzards. But it would remember them, the widow and the warrior who taught a dying town how to stand tall again. Together. Bitter Hollow never wanted her. Charlotte Bainbridge was just a widow, and Silas Crow was just a Lakota outcast. But when winter came, and the town turned desperate, the two they cast aside became the only ones who could save them. Sometimes survival isn't about forgiveness. It's about standing together when no one else will.